Okay, so we are back from break. I hope you had a good break. We only have a few days left, which is kind of freaky. When you really look at the calendar, we are down to the wire. So essentially, we really only have 2 working periods together today, next week, Monday. That third week of December is the week of the final exam, which is already online. I finished writing it on Monday of last week. I uploaded it, so it is available. You may or may not have had a chance to look at it. I don't know. I thought maybe some people would want to get it done over breaks to be done. So the exam is there. It's open right now. It'll stay open until 11:59, I believe, on the 16th. So you have plenty of time to do it. You get 2 shots at it, just like before, 3-hour time limit on each attempt. So that is there when you're ready for it. There are review sheets and support materials and stuff in the Blackboard page in the coursework area. There's a folder that has review sheets and all the information that you need there, but it's basically just the stuff that we've done since we had our midterm. So really the main topics that come up for the final are perspective, linear perspective, 1 point, 2 point, I think there's 1 question on 3-point perspective, landscape or atmospheric perspective, foreshortening, which is what we were working on right before we left for Thanksgiving break, and then a little bit of information about pen and ink wash, which is what we're doing on this last project. So remember that your last drawing that you're doing for a class assignment is actually combining 2 projects into 1. Normally, in a normal scenario, we would do 2 drawings. We would do 1 drawing entirely with pen and a second version of that drawing entirely with ink wash. We're going to squash those 2 together. So we're going to do the darker values, the middle to dark values with ink wash. We're going to do all our details and fine line work with the pen. We'll combine those 2 things together. You get 2 different scores for it for Project 11 and Project 12. So what you're looking at now is this, a stack of photographs. These are mostly by famous artists, famous photographers, and they are primarily head and shoulders photographs of people seen head on. Some of them are slightly further back, so you see a little more of the body. Some of them are a little bit, there we go. Some of them are show a little bit more of the torso, but for the most part, the ones that I picked for you there stick to pretty much head and shoulders headshots. So what I would like you to do is, if you don't have a photo already picked out of your own, because of course I'm sure none of them thought about it over the break, but if you did, you can email it to me, I'll print it for you. Otherwise, you can pick through what I have there. There are the same sets on each table. I believe on your table that they're printed front and back. I believe on these 2 tables, they are just printed on one side. So be sure to flip them and see if there's an image on the other side. There should be 30-ish choices to pick from. And what we're going to do is, rather than just make a straight up copy of a photograph, I want us to do something that's a little more fun, a little more challenging, that will allow us to play around a little bit with perhaps some aspects of surrealism. We're going to distort these images. So that was the first handout that I gave you, has some grids on it. So it probably looks a little nonsensical to you. But if you look at that handout with the grids, you notice that there's, on the upper left corner of the first page, there's a box that is just perfect squares. The grid is absolute perfect squares. And if you counted across to count how many up and down vertical columns there are, or if you counted from top to bottom to count and see how many horizontal left to right rows there are, you would see that all of the other grids on that same page have the same number of boxes, but you notice that the proportions have been changed. They are either rectangular, or there are some where they swell in the middle and get really big, and the ones on the outer edge are really small. What we're going to do is create a corresponding grid that matches what you're seeing on the drawing or on the photograph that you've selected. So if you can take a look here at this first example, let me zoom in a little bit. If I can find the zoom. I think that's it. No. Where are we? Come on. No. Oh, good Lord. That's always fun. There we go. Finally, okay. So if you look at this, which is now, of course, out of focus because these cameras are the best investment we ever made. There we go. Okay, if you look at my top row, right here just above her head, you can see that I've gone in and drawn a grid on top of the printout. So that's going to be your first step today, and I need that grid to be squares. Not that you have to be obsessive about it, but you want it to be as accurate as possible. It doesn't have to be 100% perfect, but you want squares rather than rectangles. If we take what's in a square and translate that information into a different shape, it's going to distort it. So we'll be able to make these images look a little bit funny or strange or unusual by transferring from a square grid to a rectangular one. So what I've done across the top, you guys I'm sure have played or heard of the game Battleship, right? That all depends on basic map reading skills, right? You have columns and rows, they're numbered on one side with numbers and on one side with letters, and that's what I'm doing here. I actually have 14 vertical columns, top to bottom. I've labeled those with letters A through N, but I know that there's 14 of them. If I scan down to the bottom edge of the photograph, I know that I have 18 horizontal sections. I've measured these out to be 1/2 inch wide by 1/2 inch tall. That's going to be probably the best proportion that you can work with. You could go to a 1-inch square, but there's going to be so much information in that space that it may be hard to do the drawing. So I really do recommend 1/2 inch squares. When we get to putting this onto a larger piece of paper in order to distort it, we want to do, unfortunately, a tiny little bit of math. So our large scale paper is 18 inches by 24 inches. So if I want to take this image of this woman's face and play a game with it sort of like a funhouse mirror, I want to make her look shorter than normal and stretch out her features left and right to make it wider. So in order to do that, come on, any day now. I don't want to go through that whole shebang again, but it will not let me. There we go. Okay, so I have a piece of paper here that's 18 by 24. But it's set up in the portrait orientation, so it is taller than it is wide. And what we want to do is transform this image to make her wider than she should be. So if I turn the page to the horizontal format, and I think again about how many units I have in here, there are 14 horizontal sections, vertical columns that I'm going to need here, left to right across the top. So if my paper is 24 inches and I need 14 of these guys, I won't be able to quite double it. If I was to double the number here, if I was to try to increase this by a factor of 2, if I was going to make these into 2-inch squares, I would not have enough room. I would need 28 inches worth of paper. So I don't have quite enough room there. I can increase it from 1/2 an inch to 1.5 inches, and that's going to make this come out to be a 21-inch wide drawing. So we're going to have some excess, and that's perfectly fine. What I'm going to do to make everything measurable, easy to understand, I'm going to put my marks just along the top and bottom edges of the paper so I can keep things relatively straight. And I'm marking just every 1.5 inches. So 1.5 inches to 3, 4.5 to 6, 7.5 to 9, 10.5 to 12, 13.5 to 15, 16.5 to 18, 19.5 to 21. So that's as far as I need to go. I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom edge. Inch and a half, 3, 4.5, 6, 7.5, 9, 10.5, 12, 13.5, 15, 16.5, 18, 19.5, 21. So that's going to stretch out my image left to right. I can go ahead in and connect these up so I have my horizontal columns established. And I'm going to do this fairly lightly in pencil because you don't want the grid necessarily to be the thing that people see, so you can erase this out. I'm going to make it a little darker in the demo than I would for a final project. Make it easier for you all to see. So of course the problem will be if I were to make the height also 1.5 times as big, I would end up with squares on this grid, and all I would be doing would be blowing the image up. I'd just be enlarging it rather than distorting it. So I know that that image is 18 inches tall, or has 18 half-inch units, I should say. So if I increase those to just be 1 inch tall on my paper, I can use the whole height of this page. I just mark every inch. I'll do that just on my last row as well. As soon as I get one of these in there, I think you'll be able to see that that will distort my squares into rectangles. All right, so the math part is over and the tedious part is over. I'm now going to label these inside the square, A, B, C, D. Over to N, and I'm also going to number them 1 through 18. All right, and then we look back at our original image. So if we zoom in on her again, let's try to deal with something like her mouth, for instance. The corner of her mouth sits just below this line right here in this vertical column. That is the F column. And the corner of her lip is just below the line between 12 and 13. And the mouth extends to about here, and that's in the I column. So if I look to my larger page rather, this is the F column, that's the I column. The mouth is basically in boxes 12 and 13. Her mouth is going to wind up being in this general area here, and it's going to be really wide. So what I'm trying to do is to copy what I see in each box as accurately as I can, allowing for the distortion that it's going to pull and make everything a little bit wider than it would normally appear. And as I do that, I start to achieve this stretched out appearance of that upper lip. As well as the shape of the lower lip. So it makes her look a little clown-like, right? It's stretching things left to right. Let's try an eye. If we go in and look at this eye here, the corner of it is in H8 and goes over to K8. There's H8 to K8. The eye is in here. So you'll really see a distortion with this one. Right about there is where we should start. So what I'm doing as I continue is to make this look as much like the photograph as possible, but stretching out the proportions to make these shapes fit into this new format. Really does a number on her eye. Even the iris gets stretched. So if you pull back, let me darken this up a little bit. It's kind of disturbing, frightening, funny, hopefully funny. This poor girl, arguably young-ish, pretty-ish, now looks a little bit like a monster, right? She's being stretched out left, right. We could change the proportions, of course, and go the other way. I could render this image so that she's much narrower and made really tall by working on proportions on an 18 by 24 page with the 24-inch height going this way. If you look back at the handout, you'll see that there's a couple other options in there, including one that has sort of a swell in the center that allows you to create the appearance of a fisheye lens. And on the back side, if you flip the handout over, you should see a grid that has a male face, older man with a beard and glasses. That grid is very organic shaped lines. And so his face kind of melts and contorts into those corresponding parts. So the key thing to make this really work is to be really careful with your first step. Mark these as 1/2 inch wide, 1/2 inch tall. I would start from a corner, probably the top left corner of your image. What happens if you get to the end and you either run out of space a little bit, or maybe the photograph ends before you get to the end of a column? That's okay. We can either just drop the last column completely off. Same thing here, we could drop off the bottom row. Or you could extend the image a little bit to where that would allow you to finish. You need to know how many of these units you have, how many vertical top to bottom units you have as columns left to right, and then how many horizontal units you're going to need left to right going down from top to bottom. Once you know that, in this case I had 14 by 18, I could then do some pretty basic math. What I did was just basically divide my 24-inch wide paper. Let me come in. There we go. I just did some simple math. I was taking a 14-inch wide or 14 unit wide, 18 unit tall image and stretching it out. So I multiplied 14 by a factor of 1.5. So I knew I had 1.5 inch units. That would allow me 21 inches. That would allow me to stretch her face left to right. If I were going to make it narrow and tall, I would be taking those 18 units and trying to apply them to a 24-inch space. 18 times 1.25 is 22.5. So I would be able to stretch her up height-wise. You can also play around with the other dimension. If I wanted to make this even a little funnier, if I made the rectangles not 1 inch tall, but 3/4 or 1/2 inch tall, she'd be really squashed and really stretched. So you can play with that game as well. If all we get done today is laying out the grid on your chosen image and selecting either the horizontal or vertical distortion and applying that to a larger page, we're actually in good shape. We're going to use ink to complete these images. We'll be doing the middle tones to the darker values with ink washes. We'll be doing the details with our dippable drawing calligraphy style drawing pens. So you'll be combining pen and ink wash in this final image. I want you to use 80-pound paper. So even if you have your own paper today, if it's not a heavier weight, grab some of mine from that box there. There's 80-pound paper there. Each one of the tables should have a set of images to choose from. So find an image that you like. If you don't find one that you're in love with or that you can tolerate, if you have one on your phone that you want to email to me, I can print that out for you. But step one, there should be rulers out there as well. You want to measure out 1/2 inch wide by 1/2 inch tall square grid on your chosen image, and make sure that you also label it. I would make the horizontals left to right, the numerical ones, 1 through whatever, top to bottom, and your vertical columns, make those the lettered ones. So make that a little easier for us to kind of keep in the same pattern. So for those of you who came in after we started, the handout that has some grid examples is still probably sitting on the printer across the hall. Let me grab that and bring the lights up, and you can get started.